Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the Campfire Chat organized by the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative on the topic of nature-based solutions for large-scale carbon dioxide removal. We have 5 amazing people with us to share their experience and, more importantly, their different perspectives on these issues. In a moment, I will ask them to introduce themselves. I do want to apologize to our speakers, but also maybe some of the participants. For some of them had to get up very early today, and some of them will get to bed very late today. So thank you very much for that. We will be discussing these issues around the virtual campfire. We haven't planned any speeches or big slide presentations. The idea is to have a discussion, to have an exchange, initially between the speakers themselves. And then in the second part of the session, we will open for question and answer session with the participants. Now, very quickly, a few words about the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative and about the mechanics. But before we do that, let's have a quick introduction of ourselves. My name is Janos Pasztor. I'm the Executive Director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. I've been doing this since 2016 when we started. I worked in many different organizations. My last position was in the United Nations as Assistant Secretary General for Climate Change. In that capacity, I had the opportunity to work with Manuel and René, and very happy to see you again. And before that, I worked for many UN and also non-governmental organizations, including the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNEP, and WWF, just to name a few. Basically, I've been working on climate change for the last 4 decades, and I have 3 grandchildren, and I think I owe them something to at least to try to contribute to the unfinished business of reducing the climate crisis. So I hope that our discussion today will at least be able to contribute to that, if not necessarily solve all the issues. So with that, let me ask my speaker colleagues. Manuel, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure, Jano, thank you. Delighted to be here in this campfire. And I am sure that we will have a strongly and productive chat discussion. I think this idea of campfire is very useful. So yeah, I am Manuel Pulgar-Vidal, currently climate and energy global leader with WWF International. Used to be, before of that, Minister of the Environment of Peru from 2011 to 2016, and because of that, President of COP20. And before of being Minister, I was the Executive Director of the Peruvian Society for Environmental Law, a very strong NGO based in Peru, but with a lot of influence in Latin America for environmental law. So thank you, Janos, for this invitation.
Thank you, Manuel. Kate, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, sure. And thanks very much for having me at this campfire chat. So my name is Kate Dooley. I'm currently a research fellow at the Climate and Energy College at the University of Melbourne. I've been working primarily on the issue of forests and climate change for the past 15 years or so, firstly with non-governmental organizations in Brussels, various organizations that follow forests and climate change, but also importantly, forest governance and land rights. So initially I was working on forest governance and land rights, and then started looking more at the role of forests in mitigating climate change, and in particular forest carbon accounting, and to what degree land use contributes to climate change solutions. So really excited to be talking about these issues tonight with this panel.
Thank you, Kate. Can I turn to René? Please introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you, Janos and colleagues. I am really pleased to participate today. I'm René Castro. I'm Assistant Director General of FAO for Policy and Strategy on Climate, Biodiversity, and Environment. I used to be and serve my country, Costa Rica, 3 tours of duties as Minister for the Environment, Foreign Affairs, and Natural Resources and Energy. And I've been a university professor for 15 years, and I have a granddaughter of 14 that, in the case of Janos, is the driving force to think long term. Thank you.
Thank you, René. Chunquan, can I turn to you to introduce yourself, please?
Okay, thank you. I'm a great honor to join this session, and I'm currently work in World Economic Forum as the head of Nature Initiative and the Tropical Forest Alliance, focused on the nature-based solutions. So before I joined WEF, I worked in IUCN since 2012 till last year, and to lead the China program office. And before I joined IUCN, I worked in WWF China office for 12 years, and also I've been 10 years in the Chinese Academy of Forestry. I work on the sustainable forest management, restoration, and nature conservation. So very pleased to join this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Sandeep, could you say a few words about yourself?
Yes, thank you, Janos, and thank you also for the kind invitation to be part of such a distinguished panel today. I'm Sandeep Sengupta. I'm the Global Coordinator for Climate Change at the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, where I lead the organization's institutional engagement on this topic. I'm originally from India, and I previously worked both in government and outside government in India across various levels. And today I'm delighted to be part of this panel. I'm also teaching at the Graduate Institute as a visiting faculty, where I offer courses on climate change, negotiations and governance, and on development and sustainability. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandeep. And as I said at the beginning, we have a fantastic group here, and I think you've just confirmed what I said at the beginning. So thank you very much, and I look forward to a discussion. Now, a few words about our Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative. We are a foundation-funded initiative. We have 15 people working on this in 3 continents, and our mission is very simple: is to catalyze the creation of effective governance of these climate-altering approaches, such as large-scale carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. We are impartial about the use or not of these approaches. Our business is focused on the governance, and our fundamental approach is that if societies decide to either consider or to go in the direction of making use of these approaches, then we need to make sure that they are appropriately governed. Now, one part of our strategy is to encourage learning through conversations like the one we're hoping to have today, and like the ones we have done in this whole C2GLearn exercise, where we have now had quite a few events like this on various topics. We have managed to bring together 50 experts like yourselves on this panel to talk about different issues and different perspectives. We are always trying to bring in a diversity of views, and I think we managed pretty well this time. It's not always possible to do that because we have 2, 3, 4, 5 people on a campfire chat. So sometimes there are more views than possible people. But I think on the whole, in the totality of the C2GLearn activities, I think we have managed quite well with the 50 experts that we have managed to bring together. So as I said at the beginning, the objective of this session is not to come to a conclusion, to some kind of consensus. The idea of the different speakers is not to convince each other, but it is really to understand that they come from different perspectives, and they may actually have different views on the issues. So what we hope is each one of you, when you speak, when you answer questions from the audience or between each other, that you say what you think you need to say, but also say why you're saying it and why you have that particular perspective. And of course, the discussion that will take place here is the views that you express. They're your views, and they're not the views of C2G. Now, just a few words about the topic itself. Nature-based solutions to nature-based approaches in the context of carbon dioxide removal. This year, 2020, was supposed to be the year of nature. And with the conference of the parties meeting in China of the CBD, with the IUCN Congress, and many other activities, And of course, most of those activities were canceled or postponed to next year, but the issues cannot be postponed. The climate crisis continues, and so does the biodiversity crisis. So it's in this context that we have decided to put this on the agenda, nature-based solutions in the context of large-scale carbon dioxide removal. Now, it's important at the beginning just to say a few words about terminology, because different people use different words. And I think some of this will also come up in the discussion inevitably. But we have entitled this session actually nature-based approaches, where we just believe that approach is a better description, a better word than solutions, because solutions implies, it depends how you define and what you include, of course, and maybe Sandeep, you will address that as well. But just to be clear that but we also use nature-based solutions, which is the common word and common phrase, and even its acronym NBS is very commonly used by many people. So what's inside, what's outside this definition, that remains debated. And as I said, I think we will come to that to some extent now in the discussions. Now, without getting into any detail here, we know that we will need to rely on carbon dioxide removal. We know this from the IPCC, we've known it from the fifth assessment report, but also more especially in the special report on 1.5. Whichever pathway one looks at, there will be need for carbon dioxide removal, quite substantial in some of the pathways. How much, when, who pays, which approaches to choose, these are the challenging governance questions that one faces. And today we will focus on one part of this, the nature-based solutions. But all of these questions, they really bring up the key governance challenges, and this is where our initiative tries to contribute to the debate. And there are important issues like what are the existing intergovernmental frameworks that are addressing these issues, what are non-state actors doing in this area, and we will try to address some of these, not all of these, but I hope that with the discussions that we will have, we will actually contribute to this. Now, I will stop here. The mechanics of the session, I will start off the campfire chat by asking one question from each of our invited guests. They will have 2 to 3 minutes to respond to that. And then there will be some kind of discussion between the speakers themselves. And then roughly halfway through the session, that depends on the dynamics, we will open for question and answers from the audience. And I very much hope that the participants who are there, please record your questions if you have already in the, I see there's already one question in the Q&A tab of the Zoom application. If you see a question that you like there, please vote for it. Please say like, because sometimes if there are many questions, we only have time for those questions that have more than one like. So please do that. There is also a chat functionality, but don't put the questions there. If you want to chat with various participants, do so. But we use the chat. We don't put the questions in there. So with that, let's actually get going now with the real discussion, and we get to the point where I will ask each of our guests to say a few words. So let us start the discussion with you, Sandeep. And after all, IUCN invented the phrase nature-based solutions. So tell us, what does it actually mean? What's included, what's not, and what are the implications for our discussion here on nature-based solutions for carbon dioxide removal? Thank you, Sandeep.
Great. Thanks again, Janos. It's very kind of you to actually say that IUCN invented the term nature-based solutions, but actually perhaps to give credit where credit is due, it was the World Bank in a 2008 publication that first used the term nature-based solutions. I think it was titled Nature-Based Solutions from the World Bank, from the World Bank's portfolio. But of course, IUCN, very almost immediately around that time was also very strongly engaged on nature-based solutions. And it was in 2009 that we actually used nature-based solutions in our position paper for the Copenhagen summit. I was, of course, part of the Indian team at Copenhagen and not part of IUCN, but nature-based solutions as a body of work has been something that IUCN has been working on very actively since 2012, since the Jeju Congress. And of course, most recently, it was in 2016 at our Congress in Hawaii. For those of you who don't know, the World Conservation Congresses are the place where IUCN's 1,400 state and NGO members come together to decide IUCN's priorities for the following 4 years and pass a number of resolutions to guide the intent of the conservation community on any given topic. And it was at the Hawaii Congress that IUCN members formally adopted a definition for nature-based solutions, which they defined as actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges. And by societal challenges, it could mean climate change as a societal challenge, but equally, it could also mean health or food and water insecurity or economic development. But the idea was to use nature-based solutions in an effective and adaptive manner, and in a way that could provide benefits for both human well-being and biodiversity benefits simultaneously. So there is a resolution from our Hawaii Congress that gives a formal definition of nature-based solutions, and which in a sense reflects, if you will, the broadest agreed view of the global conservation community on this topic. Now, of course, when we talk about nature-based solutions and climate change, the way we approach nature-based solutions is by recognizing the contribution that healthy ecosystems and their conservation, restoration, and sustainable management, be it forests or wetlands or drylands or peatlands, can contribute not only in terms of carbon storage and sequestration, so not only for the mitigation part of the climate challenge, but also for adaptation and disaster risk reduction. And when we talk of nature-based solutions, it's something that is based on ecosystems. So it's ecosystem-centric vis-a-vis, for example, if you talk of nature-inspired solutions, which pertains more to biomimicry, or nature-derived solutions, which could relate more to wind and solar energies, etc. But also important perhaps to bear from a climate context, and this is something that IUCN, in collaboration with several other partners this year, adopted a set of 4 principles under which were called the Together for Nature principles. And these 4 principles, in a sense, took us one step further from the definition. And these 4 principles in the climate context were signaling that, yes, nature-based solutions can provide an important solution to the climate challenge, but they have to be in the context of Principle 1, cutting emissions. Principle 2, they have to conserve and protect existing ecosystems. Principle 3, they have to be socially responsible. And Principle 4, they have to be ecologically responsible. So not just convert natural ecosystems or not just promote monocultures of exotic species. And finally, to take that one step further, what we also did this year is we launched the IUCN Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions, which tries to give an operational framework, a facilitative framework that can help all stakeholders actually evaluate to what extent or not the solution that they're implementing on the ground is a nature-based solution or otherwise. So there are a set of 8 criteria and indicators that can help to do so under the standard. So perhaps I'll just leave it there in the opening remarks, and I can come back to some of the other points later. Thank you again.
Thank you, Sandeep. This is very helpful, and there may be already some questions that arise, but I leave that aside for now. So let's move on. And René, I'd like to ask you a question now. You're, of course, with the FAO, as you said earlier, and the FAO's total work is on nature and, of course, linked strongly to food security. So in this context, what role do you envisage for nature-based approaches in the context of carbon dioxide removal? And how do you see the role of nature-based solutions from where you work now in the FAO versus being in some other international organization, maybe climate change, maybe some other entity, maybe World Health Organization or something like that? So, René, over to you.
Thank you, Janos. We are living in a world that will be 10 billion people by 2050 or around that time. In order to feed those 10 billion and at the same time be responsible with the environment, we need to fundamentally change the way we produce and the way we consume. For example, there is no room for food waste. That today is about, I don't know, 25% if you consider the post-harvest and the waste at the supermarket and the household level. We cannot afford that. It's unethical and also it's inefficient. Can we reduce emissions to the atmosphere from the average today of about 6 tons per capita to 1? That is the maximum absorptive capacity of the atmosphere. 1 ton per capita times 10 billion people, 10 gigatons. That's the absorptive capacity of the atmosphere annually. Can we do that? Well, I think we can, by first of all, reducing waste, meaning with that, no energy, no water, no labor, no transportation used inefficiently. But we did something interesting recently. How much land is out there degraded in the world? And FAO estimated that about 2 billion hectares are degraded. And of those 2 billion hectares, about 900 million could be restored with forest, grassland, soil management, several options, without competing with natural forests, cities, or agricultural land. If we do that, that will be the least cost option that we may have for the next 10, 15 years. It will cost us about $5 to $10 per ton. So with $3 billion investment, we may have 10, 15 years of breathing time. Meaning by that, we will reduce substantially the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we will gain that time, 10, 15 years, to produce other alternatives in energy and transportation, etc. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. This is that's a hopeful last sentence that you made. That there is some hope here, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. With that, I'd like to turn to Kate. Kate, in the preparatory discussions, you mentioned about your work on biodiversity first. And maybe you could explain what that approach implies and what it is and what it implies for carbon dioxide removal and on climate goals as well. So over to you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Janos. So the idea of biodiversity first is coming from a paper I recently published in Global Policy as part of a C2G special issue. And we put together what we call a threat identification framework for carbon dioxide removal. So looking broadly at all of the different carbon dioxide removal options that are discussed and exist in the literature beyond restoration of nature. And the reason for this, I think it's quite important to understand the impacts that CDR might have on biodiversity. So I'm sure everyone here is aware of the IPBES global assessment. The Intergovernmental Panel on Ecosystems and Biodiversity Services released a global assessment last year. And one of the really disturbing findings I thought in that was related to climate mitigation scenarios. So all of the 2-degree and 1.5 degree mitigation scenarios that were included in the IPCC special report on 1.5 the year before. IPBES assessed these scenarios for their impacts on biodiversity and found that every single proposed climate mitigation scenario would negatively impact biodiversity, including SSP1 for those following the modeling scenarios, including the absolute best case of mitigation with the least amount of CDR, And the reason they would all impact biodiversity is because they all include some degree of carbon dioxide removal. And as Janos says, we need some degree of carbon dioxide removal. How much, I think, is a really important question. And because of the way at the time, and I don't think it's really changed a lot, the scenario models work, the CDR included was all BECCS and afforestation, essentially. And so therein lies the problem, really. But what we did in this paper was look at all of the all of the CDR options and assess their impacts on the drivers to biodiversity loss. So through the different CDR processes, so chemical impacts, mining, invasive species, pollution, including sound pollution in the ocean, for example. So we included marine CDR options, which are often not assessed. And what we found out of this is that the only CDR interventions that don't have negative impacts on biodiversity is when you restore and regenerate nature. So we call these regenerative solutions. And the idea of biodiversity first is that carbon dioxide removal is not a solution to the climate crisis if it is contributing to the biodiversity crisis. So these things, mitigating climate change cannot be a trade-off with biodiversity. It would only have, further degrading biodiversity will only have negative feedbacks back in climate change in terms of we can't afford to lose any more of the stored carbon in ecosystems. So I think that when we frame it that way, we come to the idea that ecosystem approaches are what's needed for the amount of carbon dioxide removal that we will need to achieve. And then just the last thing I want to say that maybe we can pick up on later is that the amount of carbon dioxide removal we will need to achieve really relies on how quickly and how quickly and to what degree we reduce fossil fuel emissions to zero. And so these things are in conjunction, and there's no scenario that tells us we need X amount of CDR. It depends how much we reduce fossil fuel emissions, and nature-based approaches or ecosystem approaches to CDR are limited. So the only way we get out of this without further degrading biodiversity is limiting reducing fossil fuel emissions so that we have the minimal need for CDR. And then we can use our the approaches that René and Sandeep have just been outlining.
Thank you, Kate. And that's an important point, this last part, that whatever one does, whatever approach we choose, let's try to minimize the need for CDR to the extent possible. And that's not a bad sentence to leave on to go to the next. And with this, Manuel, I'd like to come to you, if I may. And as we've heard just now already from in fact all three of our speakers, that the carbon and biodiversity objectives sometimes are in synergy, but sometimes there are significant trade-offs. So the question from your perspective at WWF and other experience that you have, how does one build up governance frameworks to make sure that any nature-based solution can contribute positively to both and maybe other objectives as well? Can we have our cake and eat it?
Thank you, Janos. And let me start with the campfire, because I think that this will be a strong chat. It was fortunately in the first three interventions, I have found strong coincidences. Janos, are you listening? Are you hearing me well? Because yes. I know that my connection is not the best. It's okay.
It's not perfect, but it's okay.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, there is a strong coincidence in between the three of the first intervention. So let me start to framing and to answer in 3 minutes your question about governance. Let me start by saying that in the beginning, you said about nature-based solutions that we will use the term nature-based solution because it is more regular and more common for the audience. But let me say that I am not fully agree with that. I think that we should use nature-based solutions because it is becoming the recognized political concept. And as much as nature-based solution would be recognized in the political process, so I am referring to COP26 as UNFCCC or CBD COP15, it is going to be more formal. It is going to be a concept through which we should track progress, measure, and put evidence that our intervention, it is really a nation-based solution. So I do prefer to use that concept, that it is getting political traction, despite that it is an evolving concept, and that is something that during the chat I will address again. That moves me to the relation in between nature-based solutions and CDR. And René and Sandeep, they have mentioned something important. The main priority, the top priority, it is reduction, emission reductions, to reduce emission. And in my point of view, that top priority, it should be recognized as a principle, as it has been recognized by IUCN in the first principle that Sandeep mentioned, cutting emission. So having said that, that moves me to a second principle. So the use of CDR must be exceptional, as it has been said in some way by IPCC when they mention the hard to abate or the heavy emitters, or when they refer to the overshoots. So it is an exceptional measure. And also I am fully agree with Kate that we should analyze and evaluate the impact that it could have in biodiversity, because we should put biodiversity first. So that is something important. That moves me to something else, Janos. That it is, when we think about nature-based solutions in CDR, what we are addressing and putting in front of us, it is a relation in between climate and nature. And in that relation in between climate and nature, there are still a lot of unresolved topics or contentious topics. No? So what is the main or the top priority? When can we use nature intervention to address climate change? What is the mitigation hierarchy? What does it mean residual emission, among some others? And also this is applied to some other topics, for example, carbon credits. Even in the carbon credit, there are exactly the same question. And also when we think about offsets. So that is why the importance of defining clear governance principle that should go beyond of what C2G identified in that document that released, I think, in 2019, with I think it was the evidence brief, no, in which C2G put some principles in relation to multiple actors, different levels, risk assessment, rules and regulations, code of conduct, with which I am agree, but those are not enough. There are some complementary principles that should be added to have a good governance structure to address this relation between nature-based solution and CDR. Let me finish with this main idea. Also, all of this, it should be related to something that we must sort of, that it is to have credible claims, because we are in a time, and fully agree with René, that there is no room for footprints. The point it is, what does it mean? Because when we see what is happening, for example, with countries or corporations talking about carbon neutral, climate positive, net zero, and 12 titles, the point it is, which one of those it is the credible one? What is the content of those kind of claims? If we are not able to define a credible claim, that fortunately it is something that the Science Based Target Initiative it is addressing, it's going to be more difficult to define this relation in between climate and nature, or in between nature-based solutions and CDR. So many other things to say, but I would prefer to say it later. Thank you, Janos.
Thank you, Manuel, and a lot of interesting points here. Thanks for bringing on in the political dimension. But the last point you raised actually leads us perfectly into Chunquan's question that I have for him. And that's about, do nature-based solutions, in your view, provide a particular challenge for monitoring, accounting, reporting, and verification of the carbon? And exactly as we heard from Manuel, there are many claims that are being made by governments, by private sector, civil society organizations. What kind of monitoring, accounting, reporting system one requires for that? So over to you, Chunquan.
Thank you. And World Economic is really work with public and private, work government, business, and NGO, and so local communities. So this really like how to develop this like a methodology of monitoring and in a collective way to relate to accounting of the CDR and also the emission and so on. So more work with the different business sectors and to really find the good examples and to find appropriate special and temporary skills to establish a monitoring a system and accounting system. So we are talking about the dual challenges of climate change and biodiversity. I do agree. So we should put the biodiversity first. But normally, people or different group of they focus on the different aspect in a fragmented way for either look at the climate change or look at biodiversity or look like identification or focus on the food production and the water issues. But how look in the systematic integrated way, it's the appropriate special skills to monitoring, for instance, the ecosystem services and also trade off the different ecosystem services, for instance, for food security and drinking water and carbon dioxide capture and water purification and so on. So really somehow is do not have we really need a system to monitoring and accounting of the different services and also provide a solution for decision maker and report the progress. So I think that in the future, the ecosystem services is some is local beneficiary, for example, food production and timber and so on. But for the carbon and the oxygen, it's really a public good. It's benefit for everybody. You cannot say who is the benefit. But for quite often a mix of the different services and then how we can make a decision trade-off. So they are counting how to really long-term carbon dioxide capture and contribute to address this climate change issue and the benefit of the biodiversity and socio-economic development.
Thank you, Chunquan. And now I was just wanted to find out whether any of the speakers have any particular question or would like to follow up on what they heard from the others. Otherwise, I have some questions myself. But any reactions from any of you to what you heard? Just raise your hands when you have something. So. Kate, and then René after that.
Okay, this is kind of a small. It's not a substantive point, but I did want to react to what Manuel said, and it's not something I think we should focus on a lot for the rest of the discussion. But in terms of terminology, a lot of different terminology is used at the moment. I mean, C2G have advertised this event as nature-based approaches. Nature-based solutions is a common term, and it was really interesting to hear Sandeep's explanation of the current principles and definition of that within IUCN. And I think that's an ongoing process as well with the guidelines, the new process. But one thing that doesn't exist is the term nature-based solutions in any international political treaty, such as under the UNFCCC or even decision. So the Madrid COP decision, I was just searching for the exact words and I couldn't find them, but I think it was nature restoration or natural approaches. I mean, there was a really good recognition of the importance of restoring nature in climate mitigation out of Madrid. But not nature-based solutions. And one of the problems, I've always thought that the idea of nature-based solutions was a great concept. I was really pleased to see a few years ago when I first started working on this, that IUCN had defined it in quite a good definition. But it is increasingly becoming co-opted. And in particular, when Shell adopts a term, there's going to be a lot of people who don't want to use that term anymore. And so I tend to think going forward, so essentially Manuel was saying this is the terminology we have, and we will ground this in political decisions, and we should use this going forward. I think if we were flexible and all used our own different words to describe different nuanced facets of this approach that we all agree with and want to be behind, we would avoid having to discuss terminology. So that's just a sort of a general observation on the broader political discussion that's happening around terms. And unless Shell back down and decide to call their initiative nature-based, not solutions, or something different, it's very hard to go forward with that.
I guess one important point here is that it doesn't matter well, it does matter what terms are used, but it's so important to be at least clear what you mean by it and what's included and what's excluded. And then different processes may have different groups of terms that they use, but at least let's be clear always when we say this, then we mean that and not something else. And that's part of the problem. But René, please.
2 points. One is in the same line, Janos. I remember an old leader, Chinese leader, saying it doesn't matter the color of the cat, but it's relevant is does it hunt mice? I think we have that situation now. Every profession, every sector, we have their own jargon. We call mitigation something, and the people that comes from emergency and they call it differently. And they call mitigation something dealing with infrastructure and buildings and these kind of things, for engineers. So yes, we need to have some common understanding, but more important, we need to have some measurable actions in the field that we can also monitor. And probably then we will need to do a glossary of terms, for the people to understand depending on their profession or whatever it is. Secondly, let me insist in something I said. I said in my earlier presentation, nature-based solutions will give us 10, 15 years of breathing time. Okay, how we gain some time. Currently, we don't have that option. We are walking to the precipice, and we are walking toward a world that will exceed by far, not 1.5, not even 2, but I don't know, 3 or 4 centigrade of average warming to the world. That is unsustainable, and that will, force what we are witnessing in this pandemic will be multiplied by 10 or by 100 in terms of the social and economic impact. And so time is running out. What I'm suggesting is that we need badly these 10, 15 years of what I call breathing time to adjust, the negotiators, the economy, the technology. But meanwhile, we will be doing some real mitigation that, again, will be measurable, could be monitored. We need relatively small amounts of money. I mentioned 300 billion. Nobody reacted to that. In relative terms, this is not a big amount of money to win this time and to show some early success to the people around the world that will encourage other investors and other sectors to act. Over to you, Janos. Thank you.
Thank you, René. And I want to come back to something you said maybe and ask colleagues to respond to that. But before I do 2 mechanical issues. One is I'd like to remind our participants to leave their questions. We'll come to them in a short time. There are already two, but let's get some more. And Manuel, are you hearing us? Because your screen seems to be frozen. So at least let's hope that your voice is there. I shouldn't have asked this question because now it disappeared completely. But let's see. Manuel, can you hear us? Okay. I'll ask my support colleagues to see if they can get in touch with Manuel to see if we can bring him back. But the question I wanted to ask, and this is sort of following up on what you said now, René, twice, and I'd like to come back to this. You mentioned 10, 15 years. 10, 15 years as a transitional period to breathing space.
Yes, I am listening. Yeah, so sorry, and probably, yes, very well. Can you hear me?
Okay, thank you, Manuel. We at least hear you. That's good. And when we get to see you, it will be even better. But anyway, let's go on. So, René, you mentioned twice this 10 to 15 years that we desperately need because we are in a very urgent crisis situation. Is that 10, 15 years because of the permanence question related to nature-based solutions? Or how is the 10, 15 years from your perspective?
Well, I would say it's more the time we will need to restore these 900 million hectares that we have identified all over the world that will not compete with nature forests, with natural forests, with cities, and with agricultural land. This is one thing. This is the time we can do that in this period. But the second thing, I think this is what we may need for other sectors like energy or transportation to be fully mature and to be, fully available at the marketplace, and for the finance to also provide those possibilities. So meanwhile, we develop these other, options. We do have this one already on hand. And finally, it will show success. And this is important for the people and the taxpayers and the policymakers, that they will be able to show that in the term limit of a government that is usually 4-6 years, they will show that they are already moving and already, achieving some level of success. So I think this is also relevant because, as we all know here, the time horizon in climate change is usually 150 years. And that is far too is too far for policymakers, even for us as a human beings to understand well. I mean, we have seen it in the pandemic. For people, a lockdown beyond 1 month is too much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Manuel, I think you wanted to react to that. I can see your hand.
Yeah, thank you. And sorry for these connection difficulties that now are becoming very common with these virtual events. So thank you, Janos. And let me react mostly to Kate's comment. Thank you, Kate, for your comment. And it is mostly to clarify. So let me start by saying, when I talk about nature-based solutions becoming a political concept, it is mostly intuition, because it is true, Kate, that nature-based solution, it has not been yet recognized as a concept. In the COP25, it has been recognized, the title, as part of the Standing Committee on Finance. But what is clear, it is that it has been prioritized by the incoming president of COP26. So something could happen in relation to this political process, that it is natural. Some title, it could be recognized for the political process if they are planning to use nature intervention to address the climate crisis. So it could be nature-based solution, it could be some other title, but some title is going to happen. And with that, and after that, that is going to be more formal. That moves me to the second, and despite that I am double left, probably I will sound as an IUCN guy. Look, nature-based solutions, and you talk about clarity, Janos, it's becoming a clear concept. If you see not only the definition of nature-based solutions by IUCN, but also the recent release standards, those are bringing clarity. So when we think about nature-based solutions, there are three main elements, three main values: a sustainable intervention to nature, and that element, it is well defined in the criteria, so the standards. The second one, the most important, to address a societal challenge, and this is a key element of the definition, because when we think about a societal challenge, that challenge should be well documented, and as well as it could make us able to track progress, to report, and those kind of things. And the third value, it is that can bring co-benefits for nature, for the planet, for people. So if we combine that definition with the standard, it is clear how much clarity that is bringing to the process, and how important it is to recognize that not every intervention to nature, it is a nature-based solution. And that moves me to the third comment, because I am fully agree with you, Kate. Many corporations are using in a bad way, in a wrong way, the concept of nature-based solution. No, and as soon as some oil company, for example, could use it, the people is going, it could lose credibility, the concept. But that shouldn't stop or limit us to move the concept into something strong. That is why I am fully in favor of what IUCN is working on, because it is related to concept, standards, and governance body to secure the quality of the concept. And if that happens, and IUCN is working in this governance body, I am sure that this concept, it could get the political traction that we are expecting. And let me finish with this, Janos. And why I am insisting too much in the nature-based solution, because immediately when we think about mostly the two first values, sustainable intervention to nature, and second, to address societal challenge, the point it is, if CDR in relation to nature could fit with those two concepts. So again, the relation in between nature-based solutions and CDR depends in relation to nature-based solutions to those two first criteria. And it is important because based on that, we could define the principle for a good governance. Over.
Thank you. I'd like to now, following this, go to Sandeep and to Chunquan with something more, because we've talked about these ideas, but some of it is a bit theoretical. What are we really talking about? So it would be good to get a sense of what are examples, concrete examples of these nature-based solutions that would be relevant for carbon removal, while meeting some of these criteria that we've been talking about, at IUCN and what Manuel just mentioned. So has this been done, for example? Have studies sort of listed the available options and sort of see whether they meet the criteria that you were just talking about? So maybe starting with Chunquan and then Sandeep, just a few words about what are the actual options, the best options, because they meet some of these criteria. Chunquan, over to you.
Okay, thank you. And for instance, the land use change in China in the past several decades, they try to restore the forest from steep slope agricultural land into forest. So that's it's a change of land use, afforestation. That even though it's not like very rich the biodiversity, but if you really planting tree, restore the forest on the degraded or like converted land, that's it's capture the carbon and also increase the biodiversity and also provide ecosystem services. So afforestation, that is one of the very good examples. So World Economic Forum launch a new platform called 1T, the org. So try to restore, protect planting tree in the next 10 years for 1 trillion trees, so globally. So I think that's showing, I think, as one example, and also the different business sector, they are committed in a different way. Another example, very good example in China, for example, the anti-finance they have a program to get the general public involved. If you, for example, if you like travel like by like a bicycle or like use like green like consumption, then you can get some point, and then if you get enough like point, then you can donate a tree or and so on. So the finance company will like provide the financial support to real like plant tree. So in the past 3-4 years, they already like getting involved 5 million Chinese people and plant 400 million trees. So I think that's all good examples.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sandeep, would you like to react to that as well?
Yeah, thanks, Janos. If I may, I'll comment briefly on the, on the very interesting discussion that Manuel and Kate and René were having, and then I'll get down to the examples that you were asking about. So for us in IUCN, we have been using nature-based solutions as an umbrella concept. This is recognizing that there are various approaches on nature conservation, restoration, sustainable management have gone on for, several decades, if not hundreds of years previously. But what's important about the nature-based solutions concept, and as Manuel also pointed out, is that it's gotten, for a number of reasons, political traction and recognition on account of the contribution that it can make towards meeting societal challenges. So Kate, to the point that you were raising on the recognition of the term nature-based solutions in international policy fora, in the last COP in Madrid, so this is decision 1 CP 25, I think it was paragraph 15, they didn't call out nature-based solutions, but they didn't use the term nature and its contribution towards meeting the climate challenge while also recognizing its biodiversity benefits. But as Manuel said, there is a recognition of the term nature-based solutions in the UNFCCC's Standing Committee on Finance. But it's also important, I think, to bear in mind when we talk of the resolution that I was mentioning that IUCN's members adopted in 2016 on nature-based solutions. Who are IUCN's members? Manuel from WWF is of course an IUCN member. So when he says, he's coming across to the IUCN side, I mean, he is part of IUCN. But indeed, Costa Rica, China, India, Chile, these are all IUCN members. And it's instructive that in the latest NDC the updated NDC that Chile submitted under the Paris Agreement, they have actually used the IUCN definition of nature-based solutions. And I think on the terminology issue, I couldn't agree more with what René said. Ultimately, it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, so long as it, does the job of catching a mouse. And the danger I worry about personally sometimes is that if we get caught up in competing vocabularies, that might act as a diversion from the real issue of bringing about the sort of change that we want to see on the ground. And which is why, while we recognize that nature-based solutions is still an evolving concept, what we try to do is provide the guardrails through the 4 principles that, I shared and also the standard. And the important part of one of the principles, I think, as was acknowledged by the other panelists, that nature-based solutions or carbon dioxide removal shouldn't be seen as a substitute for reducing emissions from the fossil fuel-based sectors. It should be seen as something that is an addition to the emission reduction efforts that need to be taken across all sectors. And in this context, I'll just share the couple of practical, maybe nature-based solutions example. Again, bearing in mind what René said, that currently the agriculture and land use sector, forestry and land use sector, contributes to about 25% of global emissions. And this is the last IPCC assessment, half of which comes from agriculture and the other half from forestry and land use change. So the first nature-based solutions, even if we talk of protecting and conserving our existing wetlands, and just to, I think many of you may recall, a couple of years back, I think it was that, scientists discovered what they called as the world's largest tropical peatland area in the Congo Basin. And this was an area, larger than the size of England. And they found that in that one single peatland ecosystem alone, stored more than 20 times the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that that the US emits, or 3 times as much as the emissions that the world emits. So the conserving of a high carbon ecosystem like peatlands would, in our view, constitute a nature-based solutions. But equally, again, connecting back to what René said about the 900 million hectares of degraded land that are available for restoration. And there, of course, one of the things that IUCN, together with several other partners, including the FAO, is involved in is the Bond Challenge, which calls for bringing into restoration up to 350 million hectares of degraded land by 2030. And to date, we have already secured pledges of over 210 million hectares. So there's a lot of practical examples that's going on, but what's important, you're certainly right, is to ensure that the term does not get co-opted or misused, and also that there are governance and regulatory frameworks in place that allows us to monitor whether NBS is actually being done in the way that we all wish to see it being implemented in the field. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandeep. And just a quick reminder to our participants for questions. If you have any more questions, I'd like to move to questions in a few moments. But before doing that, I just want to throw out another issue to all our guest speakers. We have a number of pretty key international processes that are taking place, whether it's the IUCN Congress, whether it's the CBD Conference of the Parties, of course, the UNFCCC COP26 next year also, and various civil society, non-state actors have their own processes, whether it's the World Economic Forum or different NGOs, WWF, and so on. So I guess the question to each one of you is, what should these processes do now? Not now today, but in these days as they meet in highlighting the relationship between nature-based solutions and carbon removal, given that we have a climate crisis and given that we do have a biodiversity crisis. So what should be concretely done in these different institutions? And maybe I start with René. He has a lot of intergovernmental experience, and maybe you can address from FAO perspective to start with, but maybe given your experience, you can also look at some of the other ones. And then I'd like to have all of you respond to that. So start thinking about a good, good thing from your different perspectives. René.
Thank you. Well, I think we have provided, we at FAO and UN and others, we have provided with the basic understanding, the numbers, what may have implications and why may not have positive implications. We have helped to understand the impact of the technology and the finance, the order of magnitude, the time frame. Essentially now it's a problem of implementing and acting. And that's what is not happening. We have talked the talk, but we have not walked the walk. And this is the challenge, I think. And again, when I mentioned the time frame of 10, 15 years, is for walking the walk. I mean, we know what we have to do at the country level, at the company level, regionally, both public and private sector. We all know what we have to do. Essentially, it's a problem of who's going to do it first. And is there the need for an enabling environment and a legal framework, or is there room for innovation from the private sector? I think, many organizations have been playing games in a sense, putting us on the trap of the chicken and egg dilemma. Who's going to be first and who act first? And we don't have time for those kind of games anymore. We have to act. We have now the Paris Agreement. We have to implement it, period. What is essentially needed to implement the Paris Agreement? Investment and money from both the public and the private sector. Is that happening? No. We agree in the Paris Agreement that there will be a need for at least 1% of the global GDP per year to be invested in this. Are we investing it? No. We are far from it. And you know, and also we agreed that at least the institutions will provide 100 billion a year to catalyze this initiative. Is that happening? No, that's also not happening. So there is not for lack of instruments, understanding, you know, it's more the problem of putting our act together and walk the walk. And in our case, we're centered working with the countries in the NDCs and the National Determined Contribution, and also implementing individual projects and programs. But the scale is insufficient. We need to multiply whatever we're doing by 100 times. And this is the challenge today. Over to you, Janos.
Thank you. Kate, can I ask you to react to my question, and particularly focusing maybe on civil society organizations, think tanks, and processes that are being planned in this period of time that you're aware of? Over to you.
Sure. I think what's really important coming up in the next year in the international policy agenda is the 2030 framework from the CBD. So as René just said, we have the Paris Agreement and we need to implement it, and obviously updated NDCs due this year. Enhanced and increased ambition from major emitters is really crucial. But I'm very interested, what I'd really like to see next year from the CBD is really bold, ambitious 2030 targets along the lines of 30% of the world's ecosystems protected. And what I'm concerned about in that space, and this will link back to the UNFCCC a little bit, and what I think a lot of civil society organizations are concerned with, and I've seen a lot of dialogue about, is they see that push for bold conservation targets as an anti-people push, as a push that's conservation, protected areas, doesn't include people. And this is a huge stumbling block and a real problem, because we need those bold conservation targets, not conservation in the traditional strict protected areas sense. But they can only succeed if they're rights-based. So the terminology I would like to see on the political agenda is a rights-based ecosystems approaches. That's what we need. The CBD is founded on the concept of ecosystem approaches. And there's been so much good scientific literature actually coming out the last few years. There was that great paper from Ghana that 40% of the world's natural places intersect with indigenous people's lands. And that's obviously not a coincidence. It's because it's the stewardship and the collective ownership of these lands that conserves these. And there's more and more research showing this. So it really needs to be taken seriously. And the other thing in the scientific literature also coming out is all these papers, just another one today telling us we could sequester 299 gigatons of CO2 in ecosystem restoration, although this was all restoring converted, degraded lands along the lines that René's talking about, but different work. But really no attention at all to people in that. So if we don't start thinking about who needs to be protected, how we ensure rights are met, then there's just so much opposition to these agendas, and everything's happening in different silos, and then everyone's fighting between them. And so I'd like to see a coherent, holistic bringing together of the climate regime goals of 2 degrees and 1.5 and the enhanced NDCs alongside bold biodiversity targets that are all led through recognizing and respecting land rights.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you in particular for bringing up the issue of people. Just a couple of days ago, on Monday, we had a campfire chat on carbon removal and the Arctic, and one of our participants, she drew attention to the fact that it's nice to talk about polar bears and the disappearing ice, but there are people living there.
There's people living everywhere.
Yeah, so it's really people in them. Exactly. It's really important. Thank you for bringing this up. Chunquan, any thoughts from the perspective World Economic Forum? It's a major process, and what could come out of discussions in the WEF?
Thank you. And so next year is really like a big year for nature, for climate. So as we know, IUCN World Conservation Congress, they also will like have facilitated build some consensus, and World Economic Forum will work with IUCN to organize the CEO Summit. I think that's already been proposed and will be implemented at the World Conservation Congress. And the COP15, CBD COP15 will organize in Kunming. So that's very critical. I fully agree. We need to support, facilitate to negotiate ambitious target. That's very important. And but not only the ambitious target, but how, like, who will be like implementing to achieve this target. So one of the lessons learned from the Aichi target is more like a top-down approach, and lack of bottom-up and local government, for instance, business sectors and civil society and even individuals, not really like deep participation. And another lesson is the monitoring and accounting and the reporting. Lack of this system is how to like measure the progress to achieve this this target, except the only a few of the like 20 edge target, for instance, only the protected area. That's its progress relatively good, but for the evaluation of the nature, establish a national accounting system for the ecosystem, and that is not very well progress. And another issue, like also next year, the COP26 in November, that's like how to synergy and like climate and also biodiversity. That's is really a challenge, because at this moment we can see it's quite a fragmented way and look like a different aspect how to like I do agree with Katie said is how like to get a holistic and systematic approach to look both climate and biodiversity, and to get good metrics and monitoring and report to measure the progress. Today, like we like more focused on how to mainstreaming to the different business sectors and have business like commitment to contribute, deliver this like achieve this either like climate, like carbon dioxide like mitigation, and also the biodiversity conservation. The how like get this like accounting like the progress and in time bound, and special like link with administrative like boundary or like nature like boundary, and I think this we can get the full picture to know whether like as a whole, like a global, how to achieve this like 1.5 degree and bend the curve of biodiversity loss. So we do need a system to really like accounting and monitoring the progress.
Thank you, Manuel. WWF, what will WWF do? What can they do from your perspective in this area, this period?
Yeah, many things, but let me answer your question, Janos, by going back to the title of this campfire, because in some way I think that we are losing the idea of talking about governance and the relation of nation-based solutions with CDR. And I will answer it also by talking about the COP15 and COP26. And let me start by saying in relation to the ring question in the Q&A, that it is not that I am saying that nation-based solutions must be or is going to be recognized. It is true that currently it is ecosystem-based approach, but we all the time should assess and should evaluate what is the political trend. And it is getting traction. It has been recognized in the most updated draft of the CBD. So it could be possible that nation-based solutions could be formally recognized in COP26 and in COP15. And that is what I am trying to transmit and to communicate. But having said that, let me answer about my expectations in relation to this governance. Because first, as I've already mentioned, in case of climate, we do need to clarify strongly what does it mean net zero. We do know what does it mean in sense of balance of anthropogenic emissions and capture. But in sense of the claims, we should give clarity to that because we cannot act towards a net zero and to align it to a 1.5 without clarity of those kind of claims. And that is happening with SBTI that has just released a document to define what does it mean net zero to set targets. That is very important. The second element, it is about the exceptionality of CDR. And that is related to two things. What is the mitigation hierarchy for climate? And what does it mean for residual emissions? Those are key elements if we are planning to advance in our agenda in the CBD and in the UNFCCC. And also this is related to something that I do want to have a Kate reaction, that what it is happening with this concept of nature positive. As we have in climate, the idea of net zero, now it is emerging this idea of nature positive in sense of biodiversity or in sense of nature. I know that it has not been already recognized by the CBD. Probably it won't be recognized, but it is happening also SBTN, that it is the other SBT initiative. It is defining a mitigation hierarchy towards a nature positive. The World Economic Forum has just released, a month ago, released a document in which nature positive for business, it's becoming a clear concept. So that is something that in which we should give clarity. In relation also to CDR, we do need to work in an already proved intervention with benefits. We are forgetting what Sandeep mentioned in his first intervention. These 4 principles of IUCN are strongly clear: cutting emissions, maintaining existing forests, socially responsible and ecologically responsible. So when we are talking about nature-based approaches for solutions with CDR, we are talking about the nature intervention. We are not talking about the technological approach. We are talking about nature intervention that it could be related to restoration, to forest management, to soil capture, and those kind of things. Even afforestation could have difficulties because of species, because of social consequences, and those kind of things. So we do need to assess that kind of consequence. That moves me also to the idea of having safeguards. So it is important when we think about nature-based solutions in CDR to talk about safeguards and to talk about liabilities. No, because it is not only about risk management or risk assessment, it is about liability. So those are for me, Janos, the thing that we must address soon as a way to secure that in the COP, CBD COP or UNFCCC, we can continue moving this process forward. But those kind of things, it has not been already addressed. And still there are a lot of contentious things around the claim, around the residual emissions, around the mitigation hierarchy, and around all those kinds of things. So my expectation, and in which we are working on, it is in those kind of things.
Thank you, Manuel. Now we have 10 minutes left. I'd like to ask at some point Kate if she has any reaction to the nature positive issue that Manuel just raised. But before that, Sandeep, just very briefly, if you can say a few words about IUCN's Congress and what might come out of that in the topic that we're discussing here. And then we have one question from the audience that we haven't yet answered, and I want to bring that up as well. So Sandeep, first Sandeep and then Kate.
Thanks, Janos. Of course, the IUCN Congress has now been postponed to a yet to be determined date in 2021. So we very much wait to see what's going to happen in relation to the COVID-19 situation. But we very much hope to have the Congress as a place that can support the adoption eventually post-2020 biodiversity framework. And we are also working closely with the COP26 presidency in in strengthening the element of nature in the COP26 discussions. So just in terms of our overall expectations, I think it's probably useful to recall the last emissions gap report that UNEP had published, which basically they said that, look, right now all the NDCs added up still take us to a 3-degree world. And if we need to meet the 1.5 degree target, the NDCs cumulatively need to be 5 times stronger than what they are right now. And if we want to meet the 2 degree target, they have to be at least 3 times more ambitious. So in the context of the overall, of the need for having overall greater ambition of NDCs in general, what we call for is a stronger inclusion of nature-based solutions within the NDCs. And, IUCN together with Oxford released a report last year at the Climate Summit, where we found that although, 2/3 of the Paris Agreement signatories had recognized nature-based solutions in one form or the other, they could be made a lot more stringent. So for example, even though, 70% of the NDCs recognize the role of forests, only 20% of them had represented those in quantitative terms, and only 8% had represented them in terms of CO2 removals. Likewise for adaptation. So, as countries submit new and updated NDCs, there is an opportunity to recognize the NBS angle, both for mitigation and adaptation in a more concrete manner. And finally, I just want to, get back to the point of this whole issue was about governance of nature-based solutions, approaches, and solutions. And I wanted to acknowledge Kate's point about the importance of bearing in mind the local communities and the indigenous peoples in this whole debate, especially when it comes to nature-based solutions. Also bearing in mind that currently it is indigenous people and local communities that are managing, up to 1/4 of the world's tropical forest carbon. So while the state has its role, while the private sector has its role, we should not forget the real stewards of NBS implementation on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. And Kate, any reactions from you on the previous comment?
On the idea of nature positive, I'll try and be very brief. I hadn't heard of that, Manuel, so thanks for bringing that up. I'm not sure, it sounds to me like a term that may obscure rather than illuminate in a similar way that net zero is a term that obscures. While we absolutely need to go to net zero, that's the scientifically correct terminology, we really need separate targets to illuminate how much of that is reduction in fossil fuel emissions and how much of that can be removals of CDR. I don't know if nature positive is moving towards sort of biodiversity offsetting, where you can nature positive and nature negative and net them out. If it's that sort of concept, that is extremely problematic, and it would be not a term that brings meaning to what we actually intend or need to do. But maybe it's not that.
Thank you, Kate. Probably let me clarify, Kate, shortly, that in the SBTN guidelines that I think were released 2 or 3 weeks ago, no, they are not talking about offsets. They are talking about avoid, reduce, restore, mostly. No, it is a first draft of a guideline, but it is becoming something to define targets for companies based in the SBTN initiative.
Okay, now I'd like to go to René with a very quick, a concrete question, if you could try to briefly address that. There is a question from Saya Yatsa asking, what definition of degraded land does the FAO use? And because what is being said here is that it's a big problem that there is no clearly agreed definition of what is degraded land, and therefore it's very difficult to see what is the total capacity here. And is FAO doing any particular work to fill this gap, this information gap, on country level in consistent and comparable manner?
Yes, for us, degraded land is land that is not longer productive. And using productive in all the broader concept, of ecosystem services or agriculture or urban services or grassland or forest. I mean, in the broader sense, is no longer productive. And so also, in contrast, when we mention restoration, we don't think about restoring it to the original level, but to a level that it will be productive again, in terms of sustainability. And if somebody's interested, we publish in the Science Journal these numbers of the 900 million hectares with restoration potential, and all the numbers, all the data is available there. Is a short article of about 3 pages with 20 pages of statistical appendices and data for the world to use. Now FAO has an open access data policy. And so it is available. And yes, everybody is using different terminology, but the one we are using it, we can sustain with data country per country or region per region or globally. And eventually there will be probably some sort of homogeneous terms, but it will take a while. But meanwhile, all that is available and definitions are also official. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I have two points left and 4 minutes. So the first one is there was a comment about this panel being not particularly balanced in terms of gender. And that, of course, is true. You can count the numbers. As I said at the beginning, when I introduced the topic, we do our best to be as diverse in each of the campfires as possible. But of course, it's not possible to make sure that from a substantive point of view, from a gender, geography, and other points of view, all campfires are totally balanced on all of these issues. We had Campfire Chat, which were all female, and we also had some which were all male, and now we have one which is not particularly balanced. But this is the reality. Having said that, I'd like to ask the panelists, is there anything that they can think of that we can do to improve in this case, the gender balance in this area of work, other than doing a hard work of trying to contact all the experts that we know are working in the field? Is there anything specific that you can suggest so that we can do better? Any thoughts on that?
I think there's gender balance in the area of work. It's probably, as in most areas, seniority, there's not gender balance in more senior roles. So getting opinions from youth, different kinds of groups might improve that.
Yes, René?
Probably a simple one. Next time you invite us, tell us to invite somebody, an expert from the opposite, gender, and
okay,
we will quickly provide names.
That's a good practical suggestion. Thank you. Okay. Any other? Yes, Chunquan.
Yeah, maybe like in the future, also consider to invite from different local people, indigenous people, and also from business sectors. So to not necessarily only like the more focus on the scientific and the lead of the organization. If we'll get some real example representative from local communities, and also I fully agree with get some young representative.
Thank you. Yes, Sandeep.
Yeah, actually, I have to share that the invite that had originally come to IUCN had come to a female colleague in IUCN who couldn't attend. And so, it's probably my fault that this panel turned out not to be as gender balanced as it should have. But of course, from IUCN, we have been very, very supportive of having, climate responsive gender policies and action. And so certainly it's an important lesson that we're all learning as we go along.
Thank you. Okay, so we have 1 hour, 1 minute and 30 seconds left. Very quickly, if any of you have 10-second responses of what is the most important near-term governance action that we should strive for in this area of nature-based solutions in relation to carbon dioxide removal. We've talked about some of them, but the most important one that comes to your mind. And quickly, because we will have to close in 1 minute from now.
Recognizing rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities.
Thank you. Perfect. Other colleagues? Yes, Chunquan.
How to build this nature-based solution to the different business sectors. So, for example, put into the board discussions.
Mm-hmm. Manuel?
Net zero clarity, credible claims, and social safeguards. Those are my points.
Very, very concrete Stop trying to be perfect. Let's walk the walk and let's implement now what we have on hand. Thank you.
Thank you. Sandeep, last word.
Yeah, in the long term, we'll probably need a good regulatory framework which allows monitoring and review and verification of whatever we are trying to achieve in the space.
Thank you very much. And with that, this brings us to the end. Thank you very much to the speakers for their time, and thank you to all the participants. It's excellent discussion, and we look forward to continuing. There's still some work to do. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Bye.
Nice to meet you. Bye-bye.